We're continuing along our discussion of Avelus on Shabbos. If you noticed yesterday, we had this machlokes among the Amoraim, whether Avelus continues on some level on Shabbos, or whether it's completely suspended. So one opinion that we saw is that things that are private, that are in the home, continue of Avelus on Shabbos. And Shmuel had said, no, everything, you have a carte blanche, there's no Avelus at all on Shabbos. And as we'll see in the Maskana, this is one of the few instances where we're machmir, even though normally we're makel by when there's a machlokas and Avelus. This is one of the few instances where we're machmir and we say that dvarim shebetzina, things that are private, that are not visible to the public, regarding laws of Avelus, still apply on Shabbos. So we're up to, in the Gemara, on DAF Chaf Dalet Amid Aleph, we went several lines down, we're probably about 18 lines down, something like that. Amar Shmuel, Pachas Chova Natar Rishus. Now these two words are obviously acronyms. They stand for 6 different practices. 3 of them you're obligated to change because it's Shabbos, and 3 of them it's optional whether you want to change them on Shabbos or not. And we'll explain what we mean. So Pei Ches Zayin, what does that stand for? Priyas Harosh, Chazoras Kerala Achura Ben Skifas Amita. So Pei is Priyas Harosh, which is to undo your hair, because when you're an Avel, you have to wear you have to hood yourself. You have to be hooded, as we'll see momentarily in more detail. But we learned this before, that you have to be covered up and sort of in a state of, just imagine like those medieval monks, wearing those hoods. That's what you're supposed to be when you're an Avel in the times of the Gemara. And Chazaras, so that you have to remove on Shabbos, because that's an overt sign of Avelus. Chazaras Kerala Achurav is Ches, which means that when you're wearing the torn garment, you have to wear it in the reverse so that people don't see the tear. And number 3, Zekifa Samita, you have to turn the bed right side up again, so that, because that also is something, because the mita is not just the bed in your bedroom, but it's the couch that you sit on. So when people come over, they should see that you're sitting normally. So all of those things are obligations for you to take care of on Shabbos, that there should not be any overt signs of mourning. However, Ne'ilas HaSandal, Tashmish Hamita, Rechitzas Yadayim V'Raglayim B'cham and Arvis Rishus. The other 3, Nun, Taf, and Reish. Nun is wearing shoes. Taf is tashmish, intimacy with one's wife, and reish is washing your hands and feet with hot water in the evening before Shabbos. So those things are not mandatory, meaning that you don't have to do these things to show that you're not mourning, but they're optional. If you want to, you can. And why? Because if you refrain from wearing shoes, or you refrain from washing your face and your hands, this is not overtly mourning, because there are other people that don't wear shoes other than mourners. I discovered this when I came to Canada, right? Plenty of people don't wear shoes when they walk into the house, right? V'Rav Amar, Af Priyas Harosh Rishus, and Rav disagrees and he says, no, uncovering your hair from the elaborate hooding is also not mandatory on Shabbos. Ushmuel Maishna Ne'ilas HaSandal Derishus, the Lav Kuli Alma Vidi, the Saimi Misanayu. So Priyas Harosh Nami Lav Kuli Alma Vidi, the Megalu Reshayu. The Gemara asks a very simple question. Shmuel says that you're obligated to remove your hooding to show that on Shabbos you're not an Avel. Why? Because otherwise it's an overt sign of mourning. Well, why then is it that he doesn't require you to wear to put on your shoes on Shabbos? Why? Because there are plenty of people that are not mourners and they don't put on shoes. Well, if that's the argument, then there are plenty of people who wear hoods and are not mourners. So what's wrong with continuing wearing the elaborate headdress even on Shabbos? So the Gemara answers, Shmuel l'taimei de'amar Shmuel kol kera she'eno b'shas chimum eno kera v'chol atifa she'eno b'ka'atifas yishme'elim ena atifa. Because Shmuel holds, he says 2 halachas that are in tandem. We'll analyze the first halacha more carefully in a moment. He says, first of all, any kind of tear that's not done at the time of the greatest grief, which is at the moment of death, does not count as kriya, and therefore there's no significance to it. But the second halacha is what is significant to us now, and that is, he says, then any kind of wrapping your head or hooding of your head to show that you're in mourning, it has to be an elaborate wrapping of the head, like the way that Arabs wrap their kafia around their head and their face when they're traveling through the desert. And if you don't wrap it elaborately like that to completely hood your face, then it's not considered to be a valid atifas harosh, a valid hooding of the head, and you're not fulfilling your obligation as a mourner. And therefore, because Shmuel requires such an elaborate headdress, if you continue that on Shabbos, that's overtly a sign of a mourner, because normally people don't wear such an elaborate headdress. Maybe they'll wear a hood, but they're not going to wrap themselves like an Arab. So Machbi Rav Nachman agove didikna. And Rav Nachman demonstrated by saying that the way that you're supposed to hood yourself as a mourner is to take the fabric and bring it all the way down over your face, down until the gove didikna, which basically is the sloping where it tapers into the chin right below the mouth. Rashi calls it the holes or the indentations that are right below your mouth, which are either the jowls or the dimples. It wasn't clear to me what Rashi really means, but it's a point where your jaw starts to form right below your mouth. So Amar Rabbi Yaakov, that's where the hooded material has to come down to. So your face is really completely covered. Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Lo shanu ela she'en lo min alayim beraglav. Aval yesh lo min alayim beraglav min olav mochichin olav. So Rabbi Yechanan gives us another heter. He says you can continue with the elaborate headdress provided on Shabbos, provided that you're wearing shoes. Because once you're wearing shoes, then people can see that your reason for wearing the headdress is not because you're a mourner, but because you want to look like an Arab for whatever reason. Next, let's go back to the first statement of Shmuel now. Kol kera she'eno bishas chimo meno kera. Any tear that is not done at the time of the intense grief, at that initial moment, is not considered a valid tear. So frak the Gemara v'ha amrulei l'Shmuel nach nafshei derav karalei treisar money. So the Gemara asks a question. 1 second. What about the story when they told Shmuel that Rav had passed away? He tore 13 different pieces of 13 different garments. The way I'm understanding the question is as follows. I can understand tearing the first garment because that's when the initial grief of hearing of his death. But all subsequent garments, it's already after the fact. Why then? What was the significance of tearing those additional garments? Amar Azal Gavra Dahava Mistafina Mine. So he said, woe is me that I have lost a man who I used to be in awe of. That he used to, Mistafina means to be either in awe of, or to be frightened of, or to be stymied by. Right? What?
Awestruck.
Awestruck. That's a good way of saying that I was awestruck by. Amar Leila Rabbi Yochanan nach nafshid Rabbi Chanina. In a similar story, they told Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Chanina passed away, and Kara le Tleiser Itztele Milsa. Amar Azal Gavra Dava Mistafina Mine. And when Rabbi Chanina he heard passed away, he tore 13 different expensive silk garments, and he said, "Oh, woe is me that the man that I was so awestruck by has passed away."
So he was wearing these 13 garments.
He was what?
Wearing these garments.
It's not clear. It could be that he put one on, took it off, put on the other one, took it off. It doesn't seem like he was wearing them all at the same time. Right? So the Gemara now says, Shiny Rabbanan dekevin techol shaita mitkri shmatayu kishas chimum dami. So the Gemara answers the reason why you can justify tearing after the fact for the loss of a Talmud Chacham is because since I, as their student, have lost their Torah, every time I think about them, I realize that I'm without their Torah. It's as if it's like the initial moment. In other words, it's every memory of them and the knowledge of their absence is like I'm getting the news anew because of the loss of Torah, and that's why you can justify it. But for a regular person, you can only tear once at the time of the loss, and then you don't continue. Amar le Rabin bar Adul Rava, Amar Talmidcha Rav Amram. So Rabin says to Rava that your student Rav Amram quoted the following brisa. Avel kol shiva koru lefanav v'imbo lahachlif machlif v'koreya. That an avel can tear the entire 7 days. He has to make sure that the tear is in front of him, and if he wants to change his clothes and put on a new shirt, he's got to tear the new shirt. So, and b'Shabbos korah la'achorav, and on Shabbos he's got to make sure that whatever torn garment he's wearing, the tear is behind him and not in front so people can see it. And if he wants to change for Shabbos into fresh clothing, he does so, and he doesn't tear for Shabbos. But the question is, you see from here, that throughout the Shiva, you continue tearing whenever you put on a new garment. So how can that be if, according to Shmuel, when it's only the initial tear that counts? So the Gemara's answer is that statement in that brayse is referring to tearing for your mother and father. In other words, there's tzvei dinin, as they say in the brisker vernacular. There's two halachas of kriya. One halacha is an expression of grief over the loss of any relative, and the other law of kriya is an expression of honor to my father and mother. It's unique to my father and mother, right? So therefore, that type of kriya you can continue tearing throughout the shiva, but the kriya of an expression of grief you only tear at the initial tiding, at the initial news of the death. So now the Gemara says, Osan karoin misachen oin misachen. So the question now is, so that those tears that you tear for the other reason for tearing, which is out of honor to your father and mother, not just expressions of grief, so are you allowed to stitch them back up during Shiva or not? That's why I'm understanding the Gemara's question. So, Pligi ba avuad Rav Oshia bar kapara, chad omer ein misachen, v'chad omer misachen. So it's a machlokas between these two Amoraim. One is Avuad Rav Oshia, Rav Oshia's father. I don't know why he's not identified by name. And the other one is Bar Kapara. One says that you're not allowed to stitch it, and the other one says you are allowed to stitch it. Tistayim de Avuad Rav Oshia, domer ein misachen, domer Rav Oshia ein misachen. Miman shamia leilav me avua. Because, well, since we're not sure which one said what, let's deduce that it was Avuad Rav Oshia who said that you're not allowed to stitch it, because Rav Oshia, his son, was quoted as saying that you're not allowed to stitch it, and if he didn't hear it from his father, from whom did he hear it? So therefore it only makes sense that Rav Oshia was citing his father as saying that you're not allowed to stitch it. So the Gemara says, Lo, mi bar kapora Rabbi, shamiale. The Gemara says, not necessarily. Rav Oshia's Rebbe was Bar Kapara, who was the Bar Plukta, who was the opponent of Avuad de Rav Oshia as far as this halacha. So it's altogether possible that Rav Oshia heard it from his Rebbe Bar Kapara. And when it comes to Torah issues, when it comes to halachic issues, you're not obligated to side with your father over your Rebbe, even if your father is a great Rav. Right? You have to go with whoever you feel is more correct. So therefore, it could be Rav Oshia sided with Bar Kapara, and Taka Bar Kapara was the one who said that you cannot stitch it up. So that's, you can't prove one way or the other. Amar Rava, Avel Mitail Ba'unkali B'soch Beisa. So Rava says, based on this principle, that an Avel in the privacy of his home continues his private Avelus, as long as it's not public, he can wear his torn unkali, which is a certain kind of blouse or shirt, as long as he just stays in his house. Abaya ashkechela Rav Yosef the paris le sudra areshe ve'ozil v'asi bevese. One Shabbos, Abaya found his Rebbe Rav Yosef wearing his elaborate mourner's headdress while staying and moving about in the house. Amar le labsover lamar ein avelus b'Shabbos. So Abaya says to him, Rebbe, but we know that there's no avelus on Shabbos. Shouldn't you have to undo your headdress? Amar lei hachi amar Rabbi Yochanan dvarim shebetzina knowing. He says, yes, but Rabbi Yochanan had paskin that as long as you're in the privacy of your own home, things that are not overt to the public, you still continue even on Shabbos. Okay, that concludes our discussion of avelus on Shabbos. And as we know, we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan that dvarim shebetzina continue even on Shabbos during Shiva.
What is that?
Private matters, things that are not overt to the public. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Mishachariv Beis Hamikdash Atzeres Keshabbos. So really, in order to review this, it's worthwhile to look back at our Mishnah on DAF Yud Tes Amud Aleph. The Mishnah had said that we have a three-way machlokes regarding a one-day yontif. So let's just explain. We know that a 7-day yontif breaks Shiva. Okay? What about a one-day yontif? What about a day like Shavuos, Rosh Hashanah, or Yom Kippur? So Rabbi Eliezer says that from the time that the temple was destroyed, Shavuos is like Shabbos. It doesn't break the Shiva, and it just Shiva resumes after Shavuos is over because it's a one-day Yontif. Now, what does he mean since the temple was destroyed? Because during temple times, there was a certain aspect of 7-dayness to Shavuos. What do I mean by that? That you have tashlumin to make up a korban. You can make up a korban if you didn't bring your korban chagiga on Shavuos proper. You have 6 additional days after Shavuos to bring your korban chagiga, the celebratory sacrifice for the Yom Tov. And because you have that 7-day quality during temple times about Shavuos, then Shavuos breaks the Shiva during temple times. But once the temple is destroyed, there is no longer that feature of Shavuos that makes it have a 7-day importance. And since it's only one day, it doesn't break the Shiva. Shiva resumes after Shavuos. Comes along Rabbi Gamliel, he's the second opinion, and he says, not only do I disagree with you about Shavuos, that even a one-day celebratory Chag breaks the Shiva, but I say that even for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are also one-day holidays, even though there's no specific mitzvah v'samachta b'chagecha on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but nevertheless it is a holy day, and therefore it is connected to the mitzvah of Simcha in some way, maybe not to the same extent as the Shalosh Regalim, but nevertheless it is, and therefore even Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur break the Shiva. Come along the Chachamim, and they say the middle. We're going to be we're going to do the pshara. We're going to do the middle ground. We hold that Shavuos does break the Shiva, but Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like Shabbos and they don't break the Shiva. So we have this 3-way machlokes. Rabbi Eliezer is the most machmir, that one-day yontifs don't break Shiva. Rabbi Gamliel says all one-day yontifs break Shiva. And the Chachamim are the middle, and they say it depends. If it's Shavuos, it breaks the Shiva. If it's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it doesn't break the Shiva. So let's see now. Let's look at this. Look at it carefully. Amar Rav Gidl bar Menashe Amar Shmuel halacha k'Rabbi Gamliel. So he says we paskin like Rabbi Gamliel, who's the most lenient, that all one-day yontifs break Shiva. V'ika damasni lohad Rav Gidl bar Menashe aha. And some say that when Rav Gidl was paskening like Rabbi Gamliel, he was talking about the following: Kol lamed yom tinok yotze b'cheik v'nikvar be'isha echas u'shnei anashim avolo be'isha echad u'shtei nashim. That if a child Nebuch dies within 30 days of childbirth, and the child displayed symptoms of mortality, of congenital mortality, meaning that we know already from the time of birth that the child is not viable. Therefore, the halachas of kavura, the laws of burial, do not apply to that child. And therefore, when the child is buried, you don't have to create an elaborate processional for that child, nor do you have to create any kind of casket. You can just take the body of the baby and bury it, just carry it in your bosom and bury it in the cemetery. And the only restriction is you have to make sure that there's no problem of yichud, such that there's one man and 2 women that go out to the cemetery. That will be a problem of yichud, of secluding oneself with 2 women, which you're not allowed to do. 2 men and 1 woman is okay, but not 1 man and 2 women. And Abba Shaul Omer af bi'ish echad u'shtei nashim. Abba Shaul disagrees and says you don't have to be concerned about the laws of yichud when you're going to bury a baby in the cemetery, so therefore even 1 man and 2 women can go, because of the sobriety of the solemnity of the event, that will prevent there being any frivolity which could lead to sin. Ve'ein omdim alav b'shura, ve'ein omrim alav birkas avelim, ve'tanchun me avelim. And furthermore, at the funeral processional for this baby, since he was not viable from the start, there's no special shura, which is the row of people that console the mourner after the burial. There's no birkas avelim, special bracha that we don't do anymore today, but they would make a bracha out in the street for the mourner, or the mourner would say that bracha. And furthermore, there's no tanchume avelim, there's no special consolation of Shiva, meaning that the laws of Shiva, as far as the public is concerned, do not apply to the parents of this child. Now, ben shloshim, but if the child was viable for 30 days, lived 30 days, and then afterwards shortly passed away, so yotze bedluskima. So then the child has to be taken in some kind of casket. In other words, this is already a viable life, and you have to show proper honor. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo dluskima anitelis b'kasef ela anitelis ba'agafayin. And he qualifies that, and he says that it can't be just a tiny casket which can be carried by one person on his shoulder. It has to be a much more significant casket that can only be carried by two people, to show proper honor to a person who lived in this world for even a short period of time.
Honor?
What?
Is the issue honor?
Yeah.
It's not.
Rashi says the issue is respect to the deceased. Yeah.
And the grieving process for the parents is.
That might be a part of it, is that it helps console them when they see that honor is being shown to their baby.
But the baby that wasn't viable, those parents.
Yeah, apparently we don't take even though there's some level of respect and showing of respect, but since the child was not viable, it's not as intense of a mourning process, because there was no sense of life that was there and then lost, but there was already from the outset we knew the child was not going to survive.
It's an odd thing to start talking about who can go to the cemetery, men and women. It doesn't sort of fit here, It's sort of like they're sticking in this concept of seclusion.
Yeah, the reason I think it's put in here is because since you're dealing with the burial of a non-viable child, it's much more common that there's only going to be a few people there, and that's why the caution is given dafka over here. Make sure that there's no problem of intermingling. What?
There's no kaddish.
No, there's no, and the Gemara doesn't talk about the kaddish, at least not at this point. Va'omdim alav b'shura va'omrim alav birkas avelim v'tanchumei avelim. And for the viable child that died after 30 days, you have to create a shura, which is that row of consolation. The mourner does say the bracha out publicly, and the people have to come visit for the entire shiva and extend their condolences. Now we go on to the next category. Ben yud beis chodesh yotze b'mita. That if the child lived for 12 months, so there already even a more significant life that had made an impact on the community and on his family. So Rabbi Akiva, so there he not only goes out in a casket, but goes out in a mita, which is a stretcher, which is an even more conspicuous type of burial process. Rabbi Akiva Omer, hu ben shana ve'evarav keben shtaim, hu ben shtaim ve'evarav keben shana yotze b'mita. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says if it was just a normal 1-year-old child, that's not enough of a life or significant life. It didn't have enough time to make a significant impact on the community and on his loved ones. He has to be either 2 years old, and in which case, even then, if he was not properly growing, then that's still enough of a justification to bury him elaborately. Or if he was 1 year old, but he was mature, he was precocious, and he grew to the size of a 2-year-old, meaning he grew much larger. He looked like a 2-year-old, so then that would also be a justification to do the elaborate ceremony. But if it was just a regular 1-year-old, then that's not enough. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Hayotze b'mita rabim matzivim alav, eno yotze b'mita ein rabim matzivim alav. And it's not really clear what Reb Shimon ben Elazar is saying. I'm going to tell you what I think he's saying, and I could be mistaken. I think, literally what he says is, anyone who goes out in a stretcher, the masses will mourn for that person. Anyone who does not go out in a stretcher, people will not mourn for him. And so he doesn't really address in a very specific way what we're talking about. What I think he's saying is that it doesn't matter whether the child was 30 days old or 2 years old or 10 years old. It is important in all cases to use a stretcher. That's what I think he means to say, is because it's not that people care about the child and that's what's going to cause them to express their grief, but it's the respect that's shown at the time of the burial which will cause people to express their grief. So therefore, if you make an elaborate ceremony out of the burial, that will arouse grief among the people. Don't take into consideration, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, how much of an impact that baby had during his lifetime, but rather do whatever needs to do an elaborate ceremony to evoke an emotional response from the throngs of people.
Were adults brought out in a stretcher before they were put in a coffin? Is that...
Well, we don't see a casket being used by all people. You didn't always use. Generally, caskets were not used. Sometimes they were used, sometimes they weren't used. So, but a mita is something that was a stretcher, and sometimes it would just be draped in a talus, like we do in Israel today. We don't use a casket. Sometimes caskets are used, sometimes they're not. But apparently, a mita, at least for a child, is more conspicuous because it's a much larger apparatus than just a small little casket. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah Omer, Nikr l'Rabim, Rabbi Misaskim Imo, Ein Nikr l'Rabim, Ein Rabbi Misaskim Imo. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah tells us that it's not dependent upon age, but he agrees with the principle that the child had to have had an impact on people's lives in the community in order to justify an elaborate ceremony. And therefore, if the child was known in the community, because the child used to get out a lot, so then we make an elaborate ceremony with the public. But if the child was not known, he never went out of the house because he was always sickly and wasn't old enough to really interact with people, so then we don't make an elaborate ceremony. Umahein behesped. So now the question is, how old should the child be in order to make not just an elaborate ceremony, but a eulogy as well? Rabbi Meir b'shem Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Aniyim b'nei shalosh, Ashirim b'nei chamesh. He says something which at face value is a little bit shocking. He says that it depends whether the parents are wealthy or poor. If the parents are poor, Rashi explains to us that when you're poor, family is much more important than when you're wealthy. Isn't that interesting? Family is much more important when you're poor than when you're wealthy, and therefore, because that's all you have. When you're wealthy, you have family, but you got other things to keep you busy, right? So if you're poor, then even if the child is only 3 years old, since the loss is felt more acutely by a poor person than by a wealthy person, so then even if the child's only 3, you have a eulogy. But with a wealthy person, the child has to be at least 5 in order to have a eulogy, because otherwise his grief does not rise to the level to warrant a eulogy. So think about it, and I'm not here to make a social commentary, I'm just telling you what the Gemara says. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishmo, Aniyim b'nei chamesh, Ashir b'nei sheish, u b'nei zikenim ki b'nei aniyim. That Rabbi Yehuda says, it's not. That's not what Rabbi Yishmael said. He didn't say 3 and 5. He said 5 and 6. That for poor people the child has to be 5. For rich people the child has to be 6. And he also said that even if you're wealthy but you're elderly, the child was born to you as a ben zekunim, right? It's like born to you in your old age. Then you have the status of a poor man as far as feeling the greater sense of grief, because when you have a child in your old age, you love the child much more. Amar Rav Gidel bar Menashia Amar Rav Halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda Shama Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. And on that, Rav Gidel said he wasn't citing Rabbi Gamliel, he was citing Rabbi Yehuda. He was saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rabbi Yishmael, that the two ages are 5 and 6, not 5 and 3, and also that a ben zekunim has the status of 5 years old and not 6 years old. Okay, let's get back to our discussion of the Yamim Tovim. Darash Rabbi Anani bar Sason apischa de bei Nesia Yom Echad lifnei Atzeres va'Atzeres harekan arba asar. So he makes another related statement. He says not only does Shavuos break the Shiva, but remember we had said that if you do the burial on Erev Shavuos, then the Shiva is over in 1 day, right? So that's 7 days compacted into 1 day. Shavuos itself, because it has some aspect of 7 days, because you can bring the Korban Chagiga for all 7 days, the day of Shavuos plus the 6 following days, so then the day of Shavuos has the status of 7 days. And therefore, once Shavuos is over, we look at it as if 14 days of your Shloshim have already elapsed, and therefore you only have 16 days left of Shloshim that you have to observe. Shama Rabbi Ami ve'ikbed Amar Atudi Dehi the Rebbe Lazar Amar Rabbi Oshiahi. So Rabbi Ami heard Rabbi Anani saying this without giving attribution, and he was upset. He says, I agree with the halacha, but it does not originate with Rabbi Anani. It originates from Rabbi Lazar in the name of Rabbi Oshia. And a similar story, Darash Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Akila Deresh Galusa Yom Echa Lifnei Atzeres Vatzeres Harekan Arba Asar. The Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha expounded the same thing at the threshold of the Reish Galusa, in other words, publicly. And he said also that once Shavuos is over, 14 days of the Shloshim have already been dispensed with, and you only have 16 days left. And Shama Rav Sheshis Ikbed Amar Atudi Dehi the Rabbi Lazar Amar Rabbi Oshia. He too was upset that Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha did not give proper attribution to Rabbi Lazar in the name of Rabbi Oshia. The Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Rabbi Oshia, minayin la'atzeres sheyesh la tashlumin kol shiva, because as Rabbi Oshia had said, how do you know that Shavuos as a 7-day makeup. It's not just a 1-day holiday, but it's considered it has a certain aspect of 7 days. Shenamar b'chag hamatzos u'b'chag hashavuos u'b'chag hasukos. Ma chag hamatzos yesh la tashlumin kol shiva, av chag hashavuos yesh la tashlumin kol shiva. The fact that the Torah connects all three of the shalosh regalim and says that Pesach is like Shavuos, is like Sukkos, tells us that just like Pesach and Sukkos have a feature of 7-dayness to them, so too does Shavuos have that same feature, and therefore you can make up the Korban Chagiga, and Shavuos has this aspect of 7 days. So Ad Berei Rav Papa l'Rav Ivya Saba v'Doris. So Rav Papa was speaking with Rav Ivya Saba, and he expounded as follows: Yom Echad Lifnei Rosh Hashanah v'Rosh Hashanah Reikan Arba Asar. He said this is not only true for Shavuos, but it's true for Rosh Hashanah as well. So if the Kavura is on Erev Rosh Hashanah, once Rosh Hashanah is over, it's as if you've gone through 14 days of Shloshim and you only have 16 days left. Amar Ravina Hilkach Yom Echad Lifnei Hachag V'chag Ushmini Shalo Harekan Esrim Ve'echad Yom. He says, let me go further. Based on that, I can extrapolate the following. If the Kavura is on Erev Sukkos, and Sukkos and Shmini Atzeres are considered to be two separate Chagim, so then the Shiva itself is compacted into that 1 day of the Kavura. So that's 1/7. Then you've got the 7 days of Sukkos, that's another 7. Then you look at Shmini Atzeres as being a 7-day holiday, that's another 7. So then 21 days of the Shloshim are elapsed once Shmini Atzeres is over, and you've got just 9 days left. Now this is even more acute when you have Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios. We won't go through the calculations right now. Ravina ikla l'sura de paras, Amalei Rav Chaviva misura de paras l'Ravina. So once Ravina came to this place called Sura de Paras, and Rav Chaviva, who was the Rav there, said to Ravina, Omar Mar Yomecha Lifnei Rosh Hashanah Rosh Hashanah Harikan Arba Asar. He asked him, you're quoted as saying that if the Kfur was on Erev Rosh Hashanah, then once Rosh Hashanah is over, all you have is 16 days left, because it's like 14 days have already elapsed. Did you say that? So Amar Lei, Ana Mistaber Kama Gamliel Hu Da'amina. So he said, no, I didn't say that expressly. I just said that it makes sense to paskin like Rabbi Gamliel, that all 1-day holidays break the Shiva. That's all I said. But someone who heard me say that extrapolated that what that means is that you can count the day of the Kfur in Rosh Hashanah as 14 days. He didn't clarify whether he agreed with that statement or not, but at least he said that that's what was. I know what I said, and that person who quoted me was extrapolating. Let's go on to the next Mishnah, because tomorrow's DAF is a little bit lengthy. Ein korin v'lo choltzin ve'ein mevarin ela krovav shalmeis ve'ein mevarin ela omita zekufa. The Mishnah makes two statements. It says that the only people who express certain halachic manifestations of mourning are the relatives themselves. So therefore, if you're not a relative, you don't tear kriya. You don't bare the shoulder like Rashi had taught us before. And furthermore, the only people that we give of the special Sudas Havra, that special mourner's meal after the Kfura, only the mourners partake of that. And furthermore, the consolers who provide the consolation and the mourner's meal do so from an elevated place. In other words, they should not be sitting on the floor with the mourners. They do so on an upright couch. The Gemara now says, "Va'afilu chacham." Let's go back to the first halacha. The only the mourners, only the relatives tear kriya, no one else. Is that true? Even if the decedent was a Talmud Chacham, the Hatanya Chacham Shemeis Hakol Krovav. The Brisa says that if a Chacham dies, everyone is his relative. So Hakol Krovav Salkadaitek. Do you really? That can't be taken literally. What does that mean? So Ella Hakol Kikarovav, Hakol Korin Alav, Hakol Cholzin Alav, Hakol Mevarin Alav Berachba. That what it means is everyone is like his relative. That everyone tears kriya for him, everyone bears their shoulder, and everyone partakes of the mourner's meal out in the public. So the Gemara says, so how can you tell me that only relatives tear kriya if we know that for a Talmud Chacham, everyone tears kriya? Lo tzricha delav chachamhu. So the Gemara answers because our Mishnah is not talking about a Chacham. I agree with you. The Bryce is talking about a Chacham. Our Mishnah is talking about a non-Chacham. But then it qualifies it further, and it says, "V'i adam kasher hu chiyuve michayve lemikra," that even if the person was not a Talmud Chacham, but he was what we call an adam kasher, he was a good dude. Right? What do we mean by that? He was a good man. He lived a good life. He went to minyan every day. He wore his tzitzis. He didn't speak lashon hara. He had a good name in the community. Didn't have to necessarily be a great scholar, but he was well regarded in the community. So then also other people should tear kriya for him. The Tanya mibnei ma banav u'benosav shel adam mesim kishein ktanim kedei sheyivke v'yisabel al adam kosher. So the Gemara, the Brisa says, why is it that a person's children die when they're young? God forbid. But why does that phenomenon occur? So the Brisa says, because God wants a person's heart to be softened so that he will cry for a good person who dies in the community. In other words, God will do this in order to prepare a person to cry for other good people. So the Gemara says, Yivka v'yisabel irvona kashakel mine? Question mark, exclamation point. What do you mean? What, God is going to cause tragedy to happen in a person's life in advance of that person's other experiences for non-relatives? What, is God taking collateral from the person in advance? What the Gemara is asking is a very subtle theological question, and that is, how can God present you with adversity in order to soften your heart before the tragedies occur? Maybe let the tragedy occur first, and be given the opportunity to express proper grief. How can God say, well, I don't think you're going to express proper grief, so I'll cause you affliction beforehand? Right? That doesn't seem fair. So the Gemara's response is, El mipnei shelo bachav yisabel adam kosher. You're right, says the Gemara. It's not because in advance God will take a person's child away, but rather if a person does not cry or mourn properly over the loss of a good person in the community, God will cause that person's, after the fact, God will cause that person's child to pass away, to soften his heart and to make sure that he learns sensitivity and compassion for others in the future. So, because anyone who cries and mourns over a good person is forgiven for all of his sins because of the honor that he showed him. And it seems almost like from this statement that even if a person deserved to have his child die as a punishment, if he mourns properly over another person who's not a relative but is in the community, God will avert that disaster as well. The Gemara's question at this point is that we see that even if a person is not a chacham, you're still allowed to tear kriya, and it's virtuous to do so. So how can the Mishnah tell me that you only tear kriya if you're a relative? The Gemara's answer is the lav adam kasherhu. So the Gemara says, because our Mishnah is talking about that he was neither a scholar nor was he a very good person in the community. So the Gemara now says, but even so, but even if he wasn't such a good person, but if you were there at the time of the Yitzias Neshama, the time of the departure of the soul, you're still supposed to tear kriya even if you're not a relative. Tanya Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, ha'omed al hameis b'shas Yitzias Neshama chayev likroa, that if a person is present at the time of the death, you have to tear kriya. Lamazeh daimeh l'sefer Torah shenisrav shechayev likroa. Because what is that analogous to? If you see a Sefer Torah burning, which means that it's something spiritual is being destroyed in this world, if you're a witness to that, you have to tear your clothes. In a similar vein, you have to tear your clothes at the time of the Yitzias Neshama of any person. So once again, our question is, how can you tell me that you don't tear a kriya unless you're a relative? The Gemara's answer, Lo koi hasam b'shas Yitzias Neshama. The answer is, our Mishnah is talking about tearing kriya for a person who's A, not a chacham, B, he's not an adam kosher, and C, you're not present at the time of the death. If you fulfill that criteria, the only people to tear kriya are the relatives, because that's the only people that have to express that mourning. Have a wonderful day.